Hello, everybody. Welcome back to What Magic Is. This is a podcast about magic, the occult, the esoteric, the paranormal, the supernatural, and the weird. And we are here with the final finger in the Fistful of Fairies series. And my goodness, this is quite the way to close the fist, because we are joined today by somebody who wrote a book that was on my radar, but I didn't really go out of my way to find. And then just about 7 people said, you should read this book. You need to read this book. And then eventually I picked it up and I started reading, and I was like, well, I think I know that I need to talk to this person. And so I am joined today by the one and only Lee Morgan, who is a writer and an author of such books as A Deed Without a Name and Standing and Not Falling, as well as the book Sounds of Infinity, Traditional Witchcraft and the Fairy Faith. Lee is based out of Tasmania in the area that is known as, and forgive me if I get this pronunciation wrong, Kunani, which is also known as Mount Wellington in Tasmania. And I'm wondering if I can read, this is because this is such a wonderful little description that you had here on your book, The Gusty Deep. I'm wondering if you would be offended if I was to read the little blurb that you have there, Lee. Is that okay?
Absolutely fine.
So it says, Lee Morgan lives on a communal homestead on Kunani, Mount Wellington, Tasmania, where he creates sanctuary for other weirdos, as well as raises books, people, and ideas from the grave. He has had novels and nonfiction published by Moon Books and Three Hands Press. Having survived an enormous brain tumor, Lee is currently busy filling the room in his skull with new brains, writing folk horror, and queering the world one step at a time. Lee, thank you so much for coming on the show and talking about fairies and magic here with me today.
You're most welcome. I'm happy to be here.
Lee, before we get into the more detailed questions, again, the subtitle to Sounds of Infinity is Traditional Witchcraft and the Fairy Faith. So, firstly, how do you describe traditional witchcraft to somebody who has never heard the term before? And also, what do fairies have to do with it? Why fairies, Lee?
Well, the first question, I suppose, with traditional witchcraft is I would say that it's kind of a broad category in the sense that I see it as being traditions that have some kind of format and initiatory regime around them, and that they draw on old craft material. That could include folkloric witchcraft as well. I don't like to be too much of a stickler when it comes to these things. I think I'm a poet rather than a professor as such. So I'm kind of like, well, what does traditional witchcraft stir up for you? As for the why fairies part, well, I'd say that for me personally, that story all began when I had a encounter, I suppose you'd call it, when I was a child. There was only one encounter though, like it wasn't a regular thing. I got up in the middle of the night and went to the back door to look out, and I don't know why I did. I felt very calm, and I went out to look out into the backyard, and there was some beings standing there looking back at me. I wouldn't call them, I would say they were humanoid, but they certainly weren't humans. And at that time, I thought that they were aliens because I had a father that was very into conspiracy theories and everything like that. But later on, I realized what they were. And I began to explore a bit of a connection between witchcraft and the presence of the good folk.
Sounds of Infinity is, to my mind, probably the finest example of taking this, what people conceive of as fairies and fairies through folklore, as well as a ritualistic way of approaching fairies and putting them together in such a wonderful and beautiful way. And I really want people to realize this is a beautifully written. Your way with Wordsley is fantastic. And I really do hope that everybody who listens to this episode picks this book up, because there were parts of it that just had me absolutely shattered. And one, I remember the page number. It's page 72 in the copy that I have. And I really hope I'm okay with that. I'm not screwing that up. But page 72, where tell people to look through the eyes of a fairy. Like, consider how a fairy exists on this world, almost timeless in a way. And it's just such a beautiful, beautiful passage. I think I read it and I had like tears in my eyes. It's such a simple thing to do. And then as a ritual magician myself, a lot of times I don't really look through the eyes of entities and spirits through which I'm working. So it was such a simple and beautiful thing that you did with that passage, and that's just one part of the book, Sounds of Infinity, and the whole thing is just absolutely wonderful. So
thank you.
To get to the fairies again, as covered in my last episode that I did with David Rankin, there seems to be a bit of pedigree with fairies and ritual magic, as we can see in things like grimoires, and you bring up grimoires quite a bit in Sounds of Infinity as well. Most people these days would equate fairies with something like neo-paganism, but what do fairies have to offer magicians right now?
I think this is a really good question, actually. I see witchcraft as being my primary thing that I do, but I have had some experience with ritual magic. And the reason I chose to focus on that for Sounds of Infinity was pretty much a safety issue. It was that in folklore and local stories, you hear a lot about abductions, people who lost their eyesight, various other repercussions for dealing with fairies. But you don't hear about that as much in ritual magic. You don't or at least I've not had those stories come down to me that anybody has been abducted or taken. And so I went with that approach because I thought it was probably the safest way that you could offer a person an encounter with the good folk. I know there are some stories about them being frightened. I think I mentioned that in Sounds of Infinity with the astrologer William Lilly.
That's right.
Story in the 1600s, where he talks about otherwise staunch ritual magicians being terrified of the Queen of Fairy when they invoked her. He doesn't explain what she does, which is so terrifying, which I think makes it even scarier.
Right.
But as far as I know, nobody disappeared during it. As to what they have to offer, I think very much what you talked about earlier about the sense of the other, the sense of looking through the eyes of something so radically different to ourselves that it shakes up our anthropocentric approaches to life and allows us to view the world quite differently. I think witchcraft is different, though, like to ritual magic in that sense, where I think for witches, what keeps you safe when you are dealing with fairies is more to do with certain kindred connections and bonds that we have with them, which are different to ritual magic.
Yeah. Do you think that there's a distinct difference between ritual magic and witchcraft? And I mean, as much as you can, what do you think the major distinctions are? Because it's one of those things for me where I call myself a witch maybe on like Thursdays and Sundays, which is always one of those things where, at least to myself, and it might just be my contrary nature, is that a witch is something that other people call you. At least that's one of the ways that I look at it. But how do you delineate between ritual magician and witch?
I think that there is a huge cross-fertilization between the two things, definitely. Like, I think witches can certainly use bits and pieces of formula from ritual magic, and I think some of David Rankin's work definitely talks about the way bits of witchcraft have got into ritual magic. But I think fundamentally for me, there's a different mindset underneath, and that's why I find it difficult to define traditional witchcraft exactly, because I think it's a matter of relationship. It's to do with your connection to the spirits. I think in ritual magic, you've got a lot of formula and a lot of practices and prepared materials and things that are helping to keep you safe. Right. Whereas in witchcraft, what you're relying on very much is those connections with the unseen world, which yeah, I come back to the word kindred, I suppose, is what I would call it. I don't think that it even comes down to the practices, how they're different. I think it comes down to what keeps you safe.
For sure.
Um,
Well,
mm.
well put. Yeah. Because it's my podcast and I'm a huge fan of history, and it sounds like you are as well. What is the fairy faith of old Europe, and why is it important to know as well as pay attention to if one calls themselves a witch or a magician?
Well, for me, I see the fairy faith as being the faith of fairies, not our faith, but their faith, and that we have picked up from them through copying and observing. I believe that they were there in Europe long before our ancestors were there, and that they understand the order of things and, at a deeper sort of level than what we do. And so to me, understanding the fairy faith of old Europe is very much about understanding Europe, I suppose, and understanding what existed before we arrived. Um, and I think it is reciprocal, like the practices that we do, such as offering certain things to fairies, such as, milk and bread and various things like that. They enter into reciprocity with the good neighbors. They're a form of exchange, and they build up relationship. And I think that comes back to the concept of what makes witchcraft different to other things. I think a lot of people might try to engage in the fairy faith with the fairies, but to actually end up in a place where you have a deep enough relationship that you can know that, say, one of them watches over you, for instance, then you're starting to veer, in my mind, into the area of being a witch.
Definitely. Yeah. It's very interesting that you say that it's like the people of certain areas, and I'm going to say specifically because you can't put all of Europe into one giant package, but specifically
No.
northwestern Europe and the British Isles. Yeah, there was almost like over the veneer of Christianity, there was this other thing happening. And somebody who you bring up in your book, Emma Wilby, in her Cunning Folk and Familiar Spirits book, talks about how, a lot of these people, sorry, in our mind, we think that these people were all just church going people all the time. And she says in certain areas, these people only attended church every once in a while, but there was this other thing that they had that was more relational to the land and trying not to piss things off. It almost seems like that's is that an oversimplification on my part, or is that like for a period of time this was some real stuff?
Absolutely. I definitely trying not to piss things off. I mean, there was places you weren't even meant to walk out to, and to this day in Ireland in particular, there's still places that they're like, oh, don't go up there, or don't cut down that fairy thorn or whatever, because they will seriously mess you up.
It's so interesting that you use the word relational, because it was a very relational interaction that these people had, even if it was based out of fear for a long period of time. It was still one of those things like, you do this because this has to happen or else this might happen.
And it makes sense. I mean, if you were living with your whole life depending on your next crop not failing, fear would be a thing in your environment.
Definitely. Now, back in the day, the folklore around fairies within the British Isles and Ireland would talk of fairies as being either something like fallen angels and or related to the dead and ancestors. So how are these two understandings influential to our magic and our witchcraft today?
Once again, I'm going to have to be a bit of a poet about this and say that I think that we can accept both of those stories as possibly both true.
Sure.
This is probably a rather fairy influenced way of thinking as well, in that I find that the good folk tend to play with stories. They don't come out and tell you the definitive answer. I don't claim to know the definitive answer. I think there definitely are, just based off personal experience and folklore, certain ancestors that dwell among them and have been made into, been made into whatever it is they are. But there is definitely something inhuman about them as a creature, something that sparks from a different type of fire than the one that constitutes your average human. I think for me, the fallen angel narrative is one story that you could tell about them where you wouldn't be lying, perhaps, or that maybe that they are the children of fallen angels. They have about them that feeling of being something that comes from somewhere else.
Definitely. Yeah. For those people that don't know, obviously the idea of fallen angels is there was a consortium of angels that rebelled against God, and truthfully that they were struck down, and that now they are here among earth. And of course there's this idea with fairies, as mentioned in the introduction to Fairies episode that I did, that they're not bad enough for hell, but not good enough for heaven. And that kind of plays into it as well. Now, a word that you use quite a bit in, or at least a couple of times in Sounds of Infinity, is grafted. And I like this idea of grafting. But if fairies were grafted onto the fallen angel mythos, then in a way, aren't they an extension of the Lucifer myth, and also in a way the angelic watchers?
Definitely. I know of at least probably two or three old craft traditions who would describe the good neighbors in those terms. Usually there's a different story, because I think that that's why I'm so obsessed with stories, is that I think that each tradition of witchcraft comes back to a story, often a foundational story or some form of sacred story that explains the origins of things like witches and, fairies. And I would definitely say that to me, the good folk appear to be something in the middle between, something like a watcher, I suppose, is probably the closest thing that I could say.
The watchers are one of those things that I think more people who are maybe not just starting out in magic, but it is a myth that is somewhat often overlooked. Of course, when we start out in magic, we always like the big stories. We want to look at like John Dee and his angels and things like that. But the Watcher mythos is a very interesting one. And it particularly, yeah, as you said, as it grafts onto the whole fairy faith, there's plenty behind that door once you push on it.
There certainly is.
So much of what we have to understand fairies is, for lack of a better term, it's folklore. So what does one need to keep in mind if they're pulling from folklore, or even things like poetry, like Thomas the Rhymer, in order to interact with the others in a magical or in a witchcraft sort of way?
Well, I suppose I would start off by saying that maybe the most obvious, but also therefore least obvious thing about folklore is that it doesn't have an author. It is information that has somehow become the people's story. And I think that's really important, because if you look at a lot of deals that the good folk do with people, there's a lot of stories where it all gets undone because somebody flaps their jaw, and they take away the blessing.
That's right.
And so I think both folklore and the occasional anonymous poetry contribution can be people's way of passing down information without it actually being attached to a single name of who said it originally. Or even if it is attached to a name, it often turns out that person didn't really exist or something like that, so that it kind of allows a doorway. They generally don't like us to brag about things specifically, like about having obtained this, that, and the other from them. I mean, that varies though, because I like to point out that, the fair folk are a lot like humans in the sense that they're very various. They're not like a cookie cutter creature where they're all exactly the same. Sometimes there are variations. And I think when you approach a piece of folklore, you're looking at a bit of local culture, you're looking at a local landscape, you're looking at maybe a microculture is probably a better term to describe it, a story without a known origin point. It's been told and retold until nobody knows where it started. So, in one way, it's going to be relevant, to all understandings of the good folk, but in another way, it may not be. And you need to kind of experiment, which is a little bit probably, dangerous at times, I suppose. But I'm inclined to be careful about suggesting that people go and chase a relationship with them, unless they've reached out to you, or you take that kind of hedging your bets approach of using a ritual magic format. I'd be inclined to be careful and not to assume everything that you've read in folklore will be the same unless it's from your town. If you're lucky enough to live in like a particular part of Cornwall where that story came from, you might have a better understanding of it.
That's actually a brilliant perspective. Yeah, because I wouldn't go so far to say that perhaps in some areas this would not be true, but I wouldn't go so far as to say that it is a truly living tradition in a lot of places. A lot of places have lost what we would call like the fairy faith in their towns. Ireland's it's a horse of a different it's its own arena. But yeah, that's a really interesting. If there are people that are still living in areas in which there's these folklore that is there and that is right, it's also another door perhaps worth pushing on. Now, is it safe to say, Lee, that the way in which one contextualizes fairies and even this land, this mythical place that is called fairy itself, will no doubt influence their magic should this be an avenue which they would like to explore?
Definitely. I think obviously sort of paying the due diligence of respect for whatever the rules are that fairies have is more important than just declaring that you know the rules. I would approach everything quite humbly in that respect. I would assume that I don't know and always ask for what sort of rules they would like you to follow with any information they pass to you or any healings they perform for you or anything like that. I mean, the so-called Book of Oberon actually says like not to invoke the spirit unless you're in fear of your life.
Right.
So, there's there are some, caveats like that, I suppose, that you should keep in mind as a contextualization for sure. And I think fairies, in my experience, can see what's truly in your heart. Like if you have a respectful approach and you fumble, they're more likely, some of them, more likely to let you get away with it than if you are just there,
for shits and giggles.
Yeah, exactly. They can see through you.
Yeah. That is one of those things where that also tracks to the folklore. There's sightings that people have of beings. They're just like it's like they know everything about me already. And yeah, that tracks for sure.
They do, yeah. They are capable of being invisible and watching what you do.
Right. There you go. Why does the world of fairy provide a third way or a third path for those within magic and the occult? And I know you actually have quite a lot about this within Sounds of Infinity, but if you can summarize for people why fairy is a thing almost or a path almost unto itself.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a couple of reasons. I think fairies are a liminal creature in the sense that they seem to exist between a wrinkle in things where they seem to not have to follow the rules of the realms on either side of them, which I think comes back to, your third road in Thomas the Rhymer's story, that idea of there being another option between Christianity's very extreme world of heaven and hell. But I think, there's other aspects to that too, I think. Like, it does it makes me think of something of Dylan Thomas's they're neither wholly bad nor good, those who live under milkwood.
Oh.
That line sticks in my head for some reason on this topic. It's like the rules that apply to human ethics are not the same ones followed by the good folk. So I suppose in that respect, they offer a third path which a person can follow, but I suppose you have to be careful on the ethical side of things, because whilst you might follow their rules on their turf, you probably shouldn't follow their rules in this world. Just take your naked baby or something, that kind of thing.
It's one of those things where when you look through fairy folklore as you have through all of history and even in places like the New World, there's an ambiguity to what they consider to be good or evil. And so, yeah, it's best to take care, because you don't know what the rule book is. Angels and demons, perhaps a little bit different as far as how to operate. Fairies, it's somewhat fresh territory that many have seen, but it's just that the rules are, you don't know what they are in a way.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that's quite wonderful about it, in a way, because I think it's good for humans to have that feeling of not knowing, of being off your home ground.
The thought of fresh grass that has not been walked on before is always comes to me when dealing with fairies, I think. And there's something about that, but there's also something kind of terrifying, like who knows what's even in that grass. There's something that just you want to frolic there, but you don't know whether or not it's a good idea. But anyways, that's just my lame attempts at trying to be poetic. Moving on here. Star worshippers, in quotes, is a trait that is often applied to fairies within folklore. Although we mostly consider fairies to be terrestrial, we can consider all that, because I've heard them described as landscape spirits. It's quite a bit as well. But what role do the celestial heavens play in the story of fairy?
I think it's a really interesting question. Again, I really like these questions, by the way.
Oh, thank you. It's my job.
I read, the star worshipper thing. I came across that term in a Cornish story, I think, where it was an explanation for why the fairies weren't monogamous. That they went from partner to partner because they don't share our religion. They're star worshippers, and it's just left there, sort of hanging in the air. Yeah, I think, to me, that links maybe to the Watchers, to the idea of a stellar origin of some kind, or a sense of nostalgia for that realm. But I think with everything folkloric, there's the possibility of two explanations, or maybe even three, in the sense that people in the past, when Christianity was pretty much the only acceptable religion, the only other thing they would have had to contrast that with would have been like farmers' almanacs and things like that, that would have charted the movement of constellations and seasons and things like that. And I wonder if that was the only way people could articulate the concept of a religion that went back before an animistic religion, something which, predated the presence of Christianity. And that's my theory about it. I've heard it in more than one place too, that in folklore, that star worshipper thing. I'm not an astrologer though, so I probably can't dive as deeply into that question as some people could.
Yeah, one of the things that, and I'm sure that there are outliers, but when fairies are brought up, there seems to be a genuine lack of astrology talk around fairies. And yet, yeah, sometimes you will get these little snippets like star worshiper, or I know the term shining ones comes from from a different place, but shining ones has also been applied to such things as the stars. There's within the Book of Oberon, there's the Seven Sisters, which also maps into something like Pleiades. Like there seems to be these odd indicators, again, to a door that might need to be pushed on, which is one of the reasons why I'm having as much fun with talking about fairies as I have. It just seems like really unexplored territory. It's very fascinating to me. What is a good way for magicians or witches to think about fairies as opposed to angels, demons, and spirits?
I suppose it'd come back to my statement before, that I think it's really important for us to emphasize how strange they are. I like to refer to them as the strangers, and to remind people that they are still a major mystery. and that we don't really get to have the final say on their nature or what they want or what they don't want. I do think that they have a degree of their own local cultures of sorts in different areas. Like I've noticed that the entities as they've appeared here in Australia and in Tasmania are a bit different to how I see them back where my family comes from in the West Country in England. Different feeling behind them and perhaps therefore different rules. And I think it's okay to be a beginner forever with this sort of thing and always sit in that position of, well, I don't know. Do you want to tell me what you would like me to do and what your rules are? I think we should always remember to emphasize the mystery and the strangeness, the otherness of them. I think that would be my central thing.
Yeah. There's something that I probably should have put on the questions list that I sent you beforehand. But what do you think of this idea of fairies or gnomes? I've heard this a lot as well with fairies and gnomes or these kind of things that they travel with us. They seem to be almost like a part of us. So there's places in which there's, I'll put it this way. I'm in a place now that has its own pre-existing, pre-European, almost something, if you squint and look at it, seemingly like a fairy folklore. And yet there's people having very definite, somewhat fairy experiences. Now, sometimes these fairies or the gnomes, they tell the people that interact with them that we came with you. What is there something to this? Is that something that you've heard before at all, Lee?
I have, yes. And I think as well, we should also remember, I think I might have mentioned this in Sounds of Infinity, but that we shouldn't assume that if something appears very small, that it is less powerful than something that appears very big.
Yes.
Might sound obvious, but I think we should definitely point that one out. And my first encounter that I mentioned when I was a child happened in Australia. Eh, yeah, I don't know what to think about whether they came with us or whether they're simply capable of, maybe space is not as important as a constriction on their, but then again, you do notice local
Yeah.
practices that evolve. And I wonder if those practices belong to us rather than them,
Mm,
in a sense that, those are local things that those people have had asked of them
right.
by the good folk, because it does seem to be worldwide.
Yeah.
It's like every culture that I've come across has something like them, and everybody says that they're not human.
Yeah. Yeah, I wouldn't go so far as to say it's a cultural universal, but it's pretty darn close as far as cultures are concerned.
Yeah,
But this,
yeah, yeah,
we just there's little things everywhere.
yeah, and sometimes bigger things and all types of different size things.
Yeah, yeah. There seems to be some other stuff. We don't know what they are, but nah. I mean, the rest of the world's just like it's not real. It's make believe. It's all just in your head. It's like, of course it is. Yes, everybody throughout time has just been wrong all this time
In every culture.
in every culture, right? Now, would you say that historic grimoires, such as what we now call the Book of Oberon, you brought it up earlier as well, would be a good place to pull from for magical interactions with fairies?
I think if somebody who hasn't been approached by fairies strongly feels that desire, then that would be one of the only ways that I would suggest it. I mean, unless, of course, you've got some sort of family tradition of making offerings at a particular place, or there's a pre established thing, because unless you do that, there's nothing watching your back at all. And you never know what's going to pop up. There's a whole range of morality or lack of morality by our standards, perhaps, that exhibits itself in the good folk, to call them that. Some of them are very not good. And like that Grace Hutchins story, which is the Cornish one that I mentioned, where they talk about the star worshippers. In that story, they draw off work and life force and taking babies and all sorts from the local people. They're not a hugely benevolent force in a lot of ways, and you don't know what you get. So yeah, in a nutshell, I would definitely say there's procedures and safety instructions in ritual magic. So yeah.
Definitely. What's I love about Sounds of Infinity is that, for one, everybody, please go grab it. It's wonderful. Is that it's split into three parts. There's and I hope I get this right. It's the heart, the head, the heart, and then the hands.
Yeah,
And
that's great.
and the hands section, it deals with you've got some rituals. There's some rituals in there. I believe there's a scrying ritual that has been adapted from Book of Oberon. Am I correct?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, so it's very cool in that regard. So if you do grab the book, there's some fun to be had there. There's something to be tried should you be bold enough to give it a shot. And yeah, it's very fun to see what Lee has done in that last little section of Sounds of Infinity. Now, much of our historic evidence for ritual magic and fairies, the fairies themselves seem to be called in most cases for two things specifically. And these are things which nowadays we're kind of just like, huh? And I talked about it a little bit in my last episode. It's treasure and invisibility. So are these still relevant these days? Like what reason do we have now to go to the fairies?
Oh, it's an interestingly broad question. I think invisibility is something they're very good at, because that's how they manage to continue to exist, even though we encroach on their territory in ways that we probably didn't in most cases in the past. Like most cultures had off limits places, badlands, places that you don't go to. And often we don't do that. Often we're throwing up subdivisions on those places and cutting down fairy thorns and etc. So they have skill with that. So it kind of makes sense that if you wanted to be invisible, that they would have that power. And of course, treasure is a matter of uncovering a hidden thing, which was usually buried in the earth. In the case in the past, I mean, it still is sometimes, but I don't think that these are quite as popular today as things that people want to do. If you look at witchcraft and fairy doctors rather than the grimoire tradition, you see a different focus. You see people wanting healing, or to find out who stole something from them, or to send back the evil eye on someone, or to reclaim the fat from their milk from their cows or something like that. I think, you know, maybe they even represent the desires of different classes at that time, because, you know, there's usually a difference in the level of education that ritual magicians have. Not always, but mainly. Yeah. So I think that today, if you wanted to work with them, it would depend what your personal interests were. I mean, there's also things like glamours, the ability to, you know, enchant other people, which strikes me as something people in the modern age would probably be right into. I don't really care about it myself, but a lot of other people might. You know, and of course, healing is probably really, really important today. Lifting off cross conditions and ancestral cross conditions from people. I mean, I've got nothing against invisibility, but in this day and age, I think probably the earnest might have shifted a little bit. Like our needs have probably changed a bit.
Mm-hmm.
If you find treasure these days, you've probably got to turn it over to the National Trust or something anyway, if it's too old. At least in England.
Depends how many people found the treasure with you. And there's the old dictum, you know, like 3 people can keep a secret as long as 2 of them are dead. So, you know,
yeah, it works out fine.
That's right. It's funny that you say, it's not funny. It's actually quite on point that you say that the fairy doctors are probably the ones what one should look to. We all like to have this idea of like the ritual ceremonial magicians and invisibility and that kind of stuff. But for the most part, yeah, fairies and fairy doctors dealing with protection from elf shot, removal of elf shot, like these kind of things. That's probably where most people these days should, if they feel that this is an avenue, this third path that they would like to go down to, that's probably where one would be best to put their attention.
Mhm.
Although, as mentioned, this scrying that you have in your book, that's also a very, very cool way of interacting as well.
Absolutely. I mean, the healing side of it is probably where I would press most of my magic that comes from that realm, lifting off problems for people and sending them back into the wilderness, or taking them off one person and sending them to someone that deserves it more than that person. Sometimes that's actually the only way to remove some sicknesses,
Oh.
as much as that probably doesn't sit well for some modern people.
But I mean, that tracks with this moral ambiguity that the the fairies have. It's so interesting.
Absolutely.
My guest for the Fairies and Ireland episode, David Halpin, he brought up that perhaps it is not entirely wise to attempt to summon up or to make contact with fairies. Now, how do you feel like this? And I'm going to take a little bit from your book, which is In Sounds of Infinity. It says, the returns on engaging with fairies are only there for the initiate. Everyone else is potentially damaged by the experience or even lost. So while we've had a wonderful time talking about, fairies, they're great. Everybody just give them a ring. There's also this other part that's there. That's like there can be some real damage done. Perhaps it's not like it's maybe not for beginners. What do you say to this idea that maybe trying to summon, evoke, not the best call? What do you think about the danger that surrounds fairy?
Well, I say this as somebody that practices a form of witchcraft, which I think is also quite dangerous. Like witchcraft in general, I would say has an element of danger to it because your safety rests primarily on the strength of your relationships with other spirits. And if you misjudge that, then you're probably fucked. It's very important thing, that relational aspect of it. So there's that. But I do also think most of the people that have come to me, wanting to make contact with fairies, it turns out when you press a couple of spots that they've actually already made contact with fairies. They just don't believe they have, or they don't realize that that's what it was that they were talking to.
Right.
And I think that's why I provided some practical stuff in the back of the book. Part of it was because I wanted to show that the aspect of inspiration that you get from dealing with the good neighbors comes across intellectually, it comes across creatively, and it comes across practically. And I think that rituals are a form of physical poetry where you get to actually understand the soul of that creature just from looking at the format of the ritual. Like, it has stuff in it, it has things that you do, it has all of these elements to it that when you look at them together, it gives you, for instance, having to wash your mouth out or something like that and be completely physically clean tells you this entity is very fastidious. It doesn't want to be able to smell human. There's knowledge to this stuff. And even if nobody works with that grimoire material, even just reading it is going to teach them something about that entity. And I think most of the people who crave a relationship with the good neighbors, they've already got one. They just don't know that they do. I think in some cases that's not true. Don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting people run it this crazily, but I do think that people who are really drawn to it, who are willing to face the possibility that it is a bit dangerous, it's very much like witchcraft in that respect, that if you're willing to take that risk, it probably means that you already are that thing.
Right. Yeah. I love it. That's very well put. Yeah. One of the things that when I first reached out to you, I actually reached out to Lee via Instagram, and everybody please add Lee on Instagram if you have it. Is that unless you don't want them to?
No, that's fine.
Is that you said we will need to, in this episode, we need to talk about making agreements with the others. Now, Lee, how does one navigate this? Because again, they have a code that we will never be able to decode. They have this moral ambiguity. Agreements. How do you make agreements with something like that? What happens with these agreements?
Well, I guess one of the things to realize is that even the fairy beings that you might class as in Sealy or not particularly I mean, we divide them like that. I don't know if that is actually a warranted division, but
Right.
that is folkloric concept that there is, these two categories. Even we'll say your more morally ambiguous entities, they still don't outrightly lie most of the time. They usually do tell the truth. So if you
Mhm.
get their word of honor on something, they will keep it. But you've got to be really careful that you pay attention to what they exactly promised.
Right.
Because particularly with a more ambiguous individual, they might word it in a tricky way. So
Right.
it sounds like you've got an agreement, but you maybe don't, like you've maybe got a less firm agreement than you realize. So you've got to think about it like a lawyer and look at all the different ways that it could mean, how many things it could mean. But I would also say it's kind of the same as making an agreement with a human in that respect. I mean, humans are very various as well, very morally ambiguous in many cases. And I think we often forget that. We have murderers and we have people who molest children and all kinds of hideous humans. And you wonder what the good folk think of us as well, as we destroy their forests and places that they can manifest quietly without being looked at. We come along and cut them down. So I'd imagine that they have similar questions when it comes to how to know whether a human will keep their word with you. I would say definitely show respect and follow any rules that you're introduced to. And they tend to prefer grateful behavior rather than the saying of the human words, thank you. They're not
Right.
really, they don't love that. But I don't think they're going to, chuck elf darts into you for it. But by and large, there's usually like a kind of a sign of discomfort at being thanked because I think they think that that's all that they're going to get. Because a lot of humans say thank you as if they've actually reciprocated.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
That's something actually I'm wondering if we could hang on this for a little bit because it's actually something that I haven't covered at all in any of my previous episodes on fairies. Yeah, why is there this onus on people who were of or went by the dictions of what we're going to call the fairy faith and those of us now? Why this not saying thank you, and why do you think this exists within this strange world of fairy?
I think it just comes from a concern that most humans think that saying those words is sufficient.
Right.
Whereas amongst the good neighbors, reciprocity is the key. They don't believe you that you're thankful unless you actually come back and do something for them in return. And a good relationship with them is built up through ongoing reciprocity. Hopefully, you get past that stage of having to look at every sentence that they use very carefully, and hopefully, eventually, you develop a mutual trust in each other's reciprocity. But I would emphasize again that that makes them not that much different in some ways to humans. I mean, we often are quite happy to be said thank you to, but in reality, over time, if your friends or family don't reciprocate your efforts, you would begin to draw away from them. You wouldn't stay close with them. You require to see actions as well as words. And they want to see that you keep your bonds, that you don't say one thing when you are feeling another, because that it can see it and it's an insult. It's like you're sitting there thinking, haha, I got one over on this creature sort of thing. And then you're saying some respectful thing. They're like, sorry, I can see you.
Right.
So yeah, I guess that's what I would say about the thank you thing. They don't hate the word, but I don't think they do. Anyway, as I say, I don't want to speak for them in that way, but they hate the idea that that's all they're going to get.
Right. Actions speak louder than words for the fairies. And truthfully, as you just said, that should be the same for us. Truly.
Absolutely, it should. I actually think that that's a pretty good way to live.
Right? Oh my goodness. The fairies have been here forever. They've got it figured out better than we do. Imagine that, right? Now, how important is secrecy and silence when engaging with the good neighbors?
I think it's probably heinously important. There's, as I say, many blessings that have been removed due to indiscretions when it comes to speech. I think that if you're on good terms with them, though, and you have been for many years, you can negotiate what can be talked about and what can't in advance so that you don't end up like saying something that you weren't meant to say. I think, though, what it comes down to is that they can see through us. And if we are bragging or we're trying to take the glory for a working that they have done on our behalf, it doesn't look good for us. So it's not so much that they don't want us to tell people that we've seen them, unless they tell us not to. And there are some workings that you can never speak of, and it's actually very upsetting. there's sometimes things that worked really well, and they're just like, no, you can never tell someone that. And if you do, they may take away the blessing. So I think, in my estimate, that's what it comes down to, is that they don't want us to take credit for something or to I suppose it's ego, isn't it? They're not impressed by human ego.
Hmm. Yeah, that's one of those things that in a small way I talked about it with David, is that perhaps there's something that we have that they want, and that's this whole conversation that we had is like, we have a soul, they may perhaps that they don't, but there seems to be almost aspects, the things that we have that they want nothing to deal with, and ego seems to be the one that comes up with, is just like they had nothing to do with that. Like it's very interesting that you use the word ego, because as I've been making my way trying to find some kind of like common ground of these experiences, it's definitely one where secrecy seems to be paramount. It's up there when dealing with this sort of stuff.
It is very much so. I think it's probably one of the reasons why there's writings. I think it was something in Agrippa, actually, where he mentions that simpler people do better with fairies,
Yes.
than complex people, because of the fact that they're very straightforward.
Yeah.
There's a simplicity of being, and it kind of makes sense at one level, I think, because the reality that a fairy person is inhabiting is a lot more flat in that sense, between appearance and reality. Yeah.
Definitely. Going to change gears here. It's a word I mentioned a little bit earlier, and I haven't really done an episode on neo-paganism, and sometime I will. It's almost like a whole realm unto itself, almost like fairy. But what do you think of modern neo-paganism and their approach to fairies, and say something like the fairy that's FERI tradition?
I think this comes under similarly to the whole, what is traditional witchcraft question, in that there's so many forms of neo-paganism that I barely know where to begin.
Right.
There's some of it that I think, is quite sensible and maybe even on the improve over time, as we get more people translating folklore into the realm of the neo-pagan realm. But then there's other stuff that's completely I don't even know if it's dangerous, because I don't even know if the Good Neighbours would bother with some of them. Like I think, but then again, they might. I don't know. I think there's a whole gamut. Let me put it that way. There's everything from stuff that makes sense to stuff that doesn't make a great deal of sense. As for fairy, I know a couple of initiates, although I'm not initiated into it myself, so I don't feel that I have a deep understanding of it. But from what I've seen, it seems like there's some things in common with my understandings. Like I find it easy to talk to people that are initiated in fairy. They seem to understand the same foundations about the good folk that I do. And witchcraft wise, there seems to be quite a few things in common there too.
Okay. Sweet. So this is a big question, and of course, if you don't want to answer segments of it, you don't have to. I don't want to get it too overly personal, but what does a fairy based witchcraft or magical regimen look like to you, Lee?
Well, of course, reciprocity is there. Like if I was dealing with one of the good neighbors, I treat them with exactly the same respect I would treat a human that I respected. That they're not less important in any way. And, that includes bringing them things that they might like, things that contain elements of what you were saying earlier with soul, like the concept that we possess a particular type of what I would call fetch energy as humans, a kind of animal energy, maybe you might want to call it, that they don't have access to, that they find very tasty. Some of them find it tastier than others, and I think that that whole Seelie to Inseelie thing is based upon how tasty they find it. The ones that find it extra tasty are the ones we find a little bit intense.
Right.
But to me, I guess because of my areas that I specialize in, my creative output and also my healing work is tightly bound up in my work with them. I make offerings in return for things and also for gratitude, just in general, whether or not something's been done for me or not. I think there is sometimes, as I say, turning things around so that somebody who's more deserving gets a bad outcome than someone who is less deserving. And sometimes knowing some of them that are into things like, you know, punishing someone that killed the local fairy thorn or something like that can be helpful in that regard, because it allows you to give them over a fairy dart or something like that and say, take this where it belongs. Yeah, like any connection, I suppose it's quite organic, and the circumstances change. It doesn't have a regime as such for me, any more than any other relationship would have.
Mhm. I think the word relationship is like the key to a kind of fairy magic. And my understanding, and if you'll indulge me just maybe a minute or so, is that it seems to me, and I'm going to admit I'm fairly new to this idea of combining fairy and magic, even though it's kind of always been on the periphery of my studies. But it seems to be about being okay and in right relation to the area in which you call your home, your locale. It's like where you put your head every night on a somewhat major basis. I mean, I know some people are somewhat transitory, but it's about being okay with where you are. And I think that it seems to me it to be a little bit more, and it's not to say that people who live in cities can't engage in something like this, but it seems to be more efficacious in a way for those who live in somewhat more rural environments or rural adjacent environments. But it's just about being somewhat in tune to the season, almost in that Robert Kirkian way, to be aware of the cycles of seasons themselves, because that's something that I was always struck in Robert Kirk's work, who wrote the Secret Commonwealth, is that he talks about how the fairies, they it's all about cycles to them. They see everything as cycles. And to me, that goes to what you were saying, is that the fairy faith is in a way matching and taking the cues from the fairies themselves. So for me, your magic seems to be informed, I think, by the area in which you live, and it's pulling from that in some way and taking cues from that and bring it into your magic. And at least that's how it seems to me. And I hope that's not too different than what you're trying to say.
No, it's not too different. I think there is also, with rural areas, more places for them to appear or dance or do whatever it is they like to do without people watching them too. I think it's a little bit of both. I think it is much easier to have an encounter when you are immersed in a particular sort of environment. and it is kind of weird when you leave that environment again, spiritually.
Right.
But I think it's that too. I think it is also privacy, places where the human eye isn't looking at them.
Yeah. There's also something to be said about quiet. I think quiet is one of those things. I think that, the book is called Sounds of Infinity. And I do think in a way, sound has something to do with it in a big way, truthfully. Yeah.
Definitely.
Besides your book, Sounds of Infinity, Lee, are there any resources which you think listeners might find beneficial should they wish to explore this, if they should try to take a peek at the land of fairy?
Oh, that's a hard question. I mean, Morgan Daimler's work on the folklore side of things is valuable. Yeah, I mean, I suppose primary sources, like, to look at the original folklore, particularly if you're lucky enough to have some written about the area that you live in,
Absolutely.
that would be good as well. But yeah, for me, that's about as far as I would go, because I think it's always best to listen to them
Mhm.
rather than, you know, too much of what humans have to say about them.
Yeah. Talk to grandma as well. If you live in a small area in Europe, talk to the grandmas, talk to the grandpas. They know what's happening.
Sasha Ravich has some material which is quite strange in the capital S or the high strange sense, which is probably not, you know,
Mhm.
going to be unhelpful.
Yeah, I think as far as this kind of stuff is concerned, I haven't seen anything better than your book, Lee. So it's just such a fantastic. It's short but sweet and it's just wonderful. And I'm gonna have to wrap this up, Lee, by asking the final time, because I've every single one of these episodes in the Fistful of Fairies question, I end with this question, and it's
Okay.
and it's and it's a tough one. It's not an easy one, and it's like the dumbest question that I will ask you, but the last question
Those are
nevertheless.
sometimes the death question.
But what do you think fairies actually are? What are these things? What, man, like they're so strange. What might they be?
Oh, I don't know. What do you think humans actually are?
Oof.
I think the I think the good neighbors are a liminal creature of some type. You know, they seem content to wear different stories. They don't seem too upset by the stories that we tell about them. They have told us things about themselves, about, some have said that they were fallen and they weren't bad enough for hell, weren't good enough for heaven, that sort of thing. I know that they have the power to cast glamours and to become invisible. My instinct is that they may be to do with the Watchers, or that they may be children of the Watchers. But they do seem to have some biological processes. They do seem to occasionally have babies, and some of them seem to die eventually. Whether that is real or whether they put that on for our benefit, I have no idea. But by and large, I would say that, maybe we should allow them their mystery.
Very well put. And man, what a way to end the series, Fistful of Fairies. Yes. Allow and give the fairies their mystery. Lee, this has been a fantastic, wonderful conversation. The people have to know what's going on in your world, man. Sounds of Infinity was great. There's another book you've got coming, because you also write fiction, and I don't know if a lot of people know this, but you also write fiction as well. You've got the Gusty Deep coming out. Tell us about this
Yeah.
book.
Well, that ties into the narrative, which is in the middle of Sounds of Infinity,
Okay,
because kind of like a web, all of my work, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, all kind of joins up in
got it
some way
for
in
sure.
one big picture. And I guess the reason that I write them is because there's things that you can say in fiction that you can't necessarily say in nonfiction.
Very
And
true.
I like to tell stories that go beyond the bounds of what I can put references on.
Okay.
So that's why the Gusty Deep exists. Yeah, it's a very fairy impacted narrative about characters with deep fairy connections and stuff. Quite excited about it. It's available now. It's not available soon. It is actually available now.
Okay. I didn't know that. Oh, that's right. So it must have been, I must have screwed that up. I thought it said September 27th, but that must have been last year, was it not?
It was. Yeah.
That's bad podcaster. Do your job better. My goodness.
No, you've done great.
Is there anything else that you have coming up, Lee? I know you talked about there being classes available. Are you going to have some classes in the future happening? What's going on that front?
I've got one starting this weekend, which is primarily takes in my patrons off Patreon. But I'd also take a few other people if I know them a little bit. This is just a small one, though. I think I'm going to keep it fairly small, just because it's my first major undertaking of this sort since all my operations happened, and I don't want to, go too hard.
For sure,
so to speak. Yeah. So, probably joining me on Patreon would be the best way to keep abreast of what I'm offering in the future.
Perfect. What's the address for your Patreon? Where can people find it?
Oh, I knew you'd ask me this, and I don't know it off by heart. Damn you!
There will be a link in the show notes, but your other you do have a webpage if people would like to find yours as well.
Just leemorgansbooks.com. So
perfect. Yeah. Yes, that link will definitely be up on the show notes. And what does the future hold for you, Lee? What's going to be happening in the next 2 years or so?
I've got another witchcraft book with the publisher at the moment, which is in its editing phase, and I think will be available by September.
Amazing.
Or maybe August. I'm not sure about that yet. That's going to be an interesting one, because I wrote half of it before my tumor came out and the other half of it afterwards. So that's been my transition text, and I'm quite excited about that. Yeah, I guess other than that, I don't really know. I'm just Can
I twist your arm a bit? What is the subject of this newest book that you have coming out?
No.
Oh.
It's kind of a bit more academic than some other ones.
Okay.
But I haven't dropped the topic.
Okay.
Yet.
All right. It's got to be a secret. Stay tuned, everybody. Stay tuned. Absolutely. And when it does come out, I'll be sure to make sure that everybody knows about it. But Lee, you also have a couple of other books. A Deed Without a Name. What's this book about?
A Deed Without a Name was my attempt to kind of bring some of the more scholarly stuff that I'd been reading about witchcraft into the public eye a little bit, to kind of make it more practical. Just seemed like it needed to exist. Whereas, my other books are all quite different. Like Standing and Not Falling is kind of like my look at what I would just suggest people do not to be crazy buggers in the occult community, like just keeping it nice and, good, clear relationships again.
Definitely.
And I've written a lot of fiction other than that as well. So.
Perfect. Wonderful. And of course, Sounds of Infinity. Please, everybody pick it up. It is wonderfully written. The ideas, there's so many, every page has a new wonderful idea in there. And if fairies are something that you feel like it's worth exploring, particularly within some kind of a magical or witchcraft context, this is the one. I'm going to say this is the book to pick up. I absolutely adore it, and thank you so much for writing it, Lee. It's a wonderful piece of work, and it's going to be on my bookshelf to the end of my days. So thank you so much for writing it, and
thank you,
and thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
I shall have links to all of the places in which one can find Lee's work, including Lee's Patreon. If you like what Lee gets up to, please support on Patreon. But also grab some books, grab the nonfiction and grab the fiction, and including the Gusty Deep, which was released last September. But all of those links can be available on the show notes to this episode, specifically at whatmagicisthis.com. whatmatchikisthis.com. The show notes, there's going to be not a ton of show notes for this one because, again, I think that this kind of stuff is, much of it you have to kind of figure out for yourself and get your hands into the green grass and find a doorway to that land of fairy. And I think Lee would certainly agree with me there. So yes, you now carry with yourself the fistful of fairy. It is up to you to decide what to do with it. So, do you think that what I'm doing here at What Magic Is This is kind of cool and you'd like to support me in some way? Well, now you can, and there are 3 ways of doing that. The very first way that I'm going to take you through is the best way, and that is supporting me through Patreon. So, 1 tier, that's it. I know everybody's got like 3-4 tiers. Not me. I've got 1 tier. It is only $7. It's 7 clams American per month. That gives you access to all kinds of things. I basically have a totally different show that I do for my Patreon supporters. It's What Magic Is This, but more. And we go through things like certain entities or even a specific fairies. I did one on fairy kings and fairy queens. I've got videos on how to create your own incense, do fire cleanses, how to create a magic circle. I've got shows about Goetia and Solomonic magic. I've done shows on books. You know how much I love books. I've done full shows about single books that I think that you need to have on your shelf. My goodness, there's so much on the Patreon. It is worth supporting. It keeps me doing this thing that I do. I don't make a ton of money doing this podcast. It is my job and I love it. I wake up every day enjoying myself, but I need your support, and the best way of doing that is through the Patreon. Also, getting on there, it gives you access to a wonderful and fantastic Discord server. It's so cool. The people on this Discord server, this community, which truthfully, I was like, when I started, I was like, I don't know if I really want a community, and it's just been such an eye-opener. People, the kindness and compassion that I see within the folks that surround this show is breathtaking. Truly, that world is such a kind place, and truthfully, the What Magic Is This Discord might be the last true and decent place on the internet. I'll say that. Anyways, that's also available if you join my Patreon. Please, $7 a month, come join us. Whole different show. It is super awesome, and I truly think that my best work is on my Patreon. I get to do some really cool stuff there, including videos and audio episodes. Anyways, and also, by the way, you get to vote on what gets covered on this podcast. Like, I know you like this podcast already because you're listening to it. Well, hey, do you want to vote on some of the Patreon supporter suggested topics for this podcast as to what will be covered on future episodes of the show? Patreon, come on by. We've got polls. We vote on what gets covered on this podcast. It's a load of fun. I just put up 16 new topics, and I'm going to be picking 8 of them to be the next episodes of this show. But also, you can tell me what episodes you might want to hear, and then I'll put those up on the poll. That's how it works. It's a democracy on the What Magic Is This Patreon. So anyways, $7 a month. It's great. Keeps me alive, keeps food in my tum-tum, keeps a roof over my head. Please, I cannot do this without you. If you have the ability to support what I do, I would appreciate you being able to do so. All right? Otherwise, you can also support me through PayPal. Go to whatmagicisthis.com, click any one of the PayPal me links there. You know that PayPal symbol, the 2 P's. Click those. You can donate $5, $10, $20, $500,000. Any amount helps. It all goes back into making this podcast run the way that it does. Hosting is expensive. Plugins for my editing software are expensive. Everything's getting super expensive these days. So if you support through the PayPal, that just goes right back into making sure that this show, the hamster wheel, it gives the pellets to the hamster that runs on the wheel that powers What Magic Is This. I'll just put it that way. The third way of supporting What Magic Is This is showing your support. So that's buying some t-shirts and some mugs, some notebooks, some tote bags. I was out with one of my tote bags and I got a compliment. Somebody was like, "Hey, that's a really cool tote bag." what magic is this? They actually did that thing, and I was like, oh, it's a pretty cool podcast. You should listen. The host is extremely sexy, knowledgeable, and just sounds like an awesome guy. And the person was like, cool, I'll give it a shot. Anyways, that situation might happen to you, except maybe not saying the same things that I did. Anyhow, please head to whatmagicisthis.com and click on merchandise in the menu. So much cool stuff there. Somebody just bought a hoodie. Also today, somebody bought a tank top. And in fact, even in the What Magic Is This Discord, somebody was showing off their pipes. There was a gun show with somebody wearing a What Magic Is This tank top. So it's not just nerdy skinny people that listen to What Magic Is This. We got some bruisers that listen to this show as well. So we got the brains, we got the bronze, and we have both in the same package all at the same time. Everybody loves What Magic Is This, and yes, show your support by buying some merchandise. It's a great way. I don't see a ton of money from that, but it's cool if you grab a shirt and you take a picture and send it to me. I love seeing people wearing my stuff. It's so surreal. But the place that I really want to see you is Patreon. That is patreon.com/whatmagicisthis. Please, $7 a month. That's all I ask for. Whole different show. That is the thing that keeps me alive today. So all of those things, including the show notes and where to find all of Lee's work and all of Lee's places on the World Wide Web, are available at whatmagicisthis.com. We will see you over there. Lee, this has been a fantastic, wonderful conversation. I hope that if some point in the future, if we were to ask you to come back on the show, you'd be happy to do so.
I certainly would.
Wonderful, folks. That's it. That's the Fistful of Fairies. You made it. We've gone through every single finger, and with this clutching fist, I hope you will take it out into the world and at least find the good neighbors, or at least perhaps give them an offering of something that you think that they might enjoy. But with that, we do have to put a close to this series. I want to thank all of my guests for this one, but particularly Lee for joining me on this episode. And that is the show, everybody. So come on back to What Magic Is This? We'll talk about more of this strange, invisible, treasure hunting, healing, elf dart shooting thing that we like to call magic and witchcraft and the occult. Until next time, I want each and every one of you to stay happy, to stay healthy, and to stay luminous. Until then, goodbye.